very much, Presiding Officer. An email revealed yesterday at the UK COVID inquiry included, really, SNP members are groaning because we're asking about the COVID inquiry. So let me start again. Thank you, Presiding Officer. An email revealed yesterday by the UK COVID inquiry included senior SNP government figures discussing the travel ban to Spain in July 2020. The email says, "I am extremely concerned about this. It won't matter how much ministers might justify it on health grounds. The Spanish government will conclude it is entirely political. They won't forget. There is a real possibility they will never approve EU membership for an independent Scotland as a result." This wasn't a low-level consideration. The people included in this discussion were Nicola Sturgeon, absent again from Parliament; John Swinney, absent again from Parliament; Jean Freeman and Humza Yousaf. So, First Minister, why was independence even considered in a decision about public health?
First Minister.
Of course, it wasn't, Presiding Officer. And Douglas Ross, when he says this email came from a senior SNP official, it was from a Scottish Government civil servant, not from John Swinney, nor Nicola Sturgeon, nor from myself, or indeed from Jean Freeman. To suggest the decision around Spain was made for any other reason than epidemiology, I'm afraid, is an absolute fantasy. And even if we accepted Douglas Ross's example, or Douglas Ross's framing of the situation, that we were looking at this through a constitutional lens and attempting to curry favour with Spain, then surely we would have put them on the exempt list. We didn't put them on the exempt list, is the exact point. And why did we not do that? Because let's look at the epidemiology at that point. That Scotland did not include Spain on the exempt list like England and Wales did. Why? Because their point of prevalence at that time was 0.33. That was 4 times higher than the point of prevalence in Scotland. So that was, in fact, Spain was the only country at that point proposed for the exempt list that had significantly higher prevalence higher prevalence than Scotland did at the time. When I look at the evidence and the advice from the Chief Medical Officer at the time, he expressed concern about the importation risks. So ministers concluded that they should not add Spain to the list of exempted countries due to our lower prevalence and the fact that Spain had 4 times higher prevalence, Presiding Officer. So Douglas Ross can do his best to spin. He can do his best to throw insults. He can do his best to try to malign and misrepresent facts and malign not just ministers but civil servants. But I believe the people of Scotland know, for all of the challenges that we had during the pandemic, that the Scottish Government always prioritised protecting the public from the harms of COVID. I don't think Douglas Ross can say the same of his party in the UK Government.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you. Amid pretty stiff competition, that might be the most bizarre answer I've ever heard from Humza Yousaf. He's saying it's fact. So here is a fact. The day after Humza Yousaf received that email speaking about political concerns that there might be with the Spanish government allowing an independent Scotland into the EU, he stood up and announced that they were introducing a travel corridor with Spain. The very next day, they opened up travel to Spain, and 5 days later, they had to close it down again because COVID cases were rocketing. That's a fact, and we know it because Humza Yousaf told us. And it's black and white in evidence to the inquiry that they were thinking about independence instead of focusing purely on public health. Now, what we've not seen is any evidence of Humza Yousaf's response to that email. And Nicola Sturgeon's messages have all gone from that time because she deleted them. The former SNP leader destroyed all of her WhatsApp messages despite knowing that a do not destroy order was in place, despite promising grieving families she would be transparent, despite assuring journalists that all her messages would be handed to the inquiry. She told the press unequivocally, yes, her messages would be provided. So why did Nicola Sturgeon say yes when she actually meant no?
First Minister.
First of all, can I say once again, effective from 10th of July 2020, Spain was not included on the first exempt countries list due to the higher prevalence. It had higher, 4 times higher than it had in relation to Scotland. Let me just say, in relation to WhatsApp messages, Douglas Ross has thrown all sorts of incendiary accusations the way, particularly of Nicola Sturgeon for not retaining WhatsApp messages. He's demanded investigations and reviews. But not only did his boss, the Prime Minister, not retain his messages, he actually took the inquiry to court and lost. But just over the last hour, we've heard from Alistair Jack, again, Douglas Ross's boss, when he was in the Scotland office. And what did Alistair Jack say about his WhatsApp messages? He was asked, did he delete his WhatsApp messages? And here's what Alistair Jack said. He says, I did delete them, and he deleted them because he wanted to free up storage capacity on his phone. When he was asked if there was any government business on these WhatsApps, he said, and I will quote him directly, I didn't think anything of it. When he was asked if he considered the needs of the public inquiry, here's what he said, and I will quote directly, no, I didn't. I was quite keen for my phone to start working again, is what he said, Presiding Officer. So it is astonishing that Douglas Ross demands investigations and reviews in relation to Nicola Sturgeon for not retaining her WhatsApps. But his boss, his colleague, who deletes his WhatsApps, didn't even think about the inquiry. Well, that's perfectly fine. Well, there's one word for that, Presiding Officer, and it's hypocrisy, and the people of Scotland can see right through Douglas Ross.
Douglas Ross.
It is not perfectly fine. Alistair Jack was wrong to delete his WhatsApp messages. He has apologised and he regrets it. Humza Yousaf can't step out of the shadow of his disgraced predecessor and say the same. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon has not apologised. She has not apologised for doing it. She has said she was right because she was following government policy. That's a massive difference, First Minister. But I can't let the First Minister's confusion over this travel ban with Spain pass. He's just saying that they kept in place the restrictions with Spain. On the 20th of July, the day after that email was sent, Humza Yousaf said, and I quote, "We are able to lift the requirement for those travelling from Spain." 5 days later, he says the decision to exempt Spain earlier this week was taken when the data showed there was an improvement. The latest data has given us cause for concern to overturn that decision. So he definitely made a decision on the back of that email.
Mr Ross, can I just ask the front bench to please resist any temptation to contribute? Mr Ross.
Well, I think they're trying to come up with a story here because what the First Minister has said so far does not match what he did in practice in 2020. But we know that the deleted WhatsApp messages were covering up major decisions from this SNP government. We know that because of the messages we have been able to see. Humza Yousaf, when he was then Health Secretary in charge of the NHS, joked with the National Clinical Director, Jason Leach. They laughed about false claims that children were hospitalised because of COVID. And in one revealing exchange, Humza Yousaf said this, "I'm winging it and will get found out sooner or later." First Minister, at what point do you think you were finally found out?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, let's again look at the facts. Where Douglas Ross is right, of course, there was Spain initially not exempt from a travel corridor and then put on a travel corridor. Why were they? Because we have the data that the UK government presented by the London School of Hygiene.
First Minister, do you know we have so many members who want to put questions to the First Minister? That would be more likely if we could get on with our session and if I don't have to keep asking front benches to resist the temptation to contribute when they shouldn't be. First Minister.
Well, they don't want to listen to the facts, and the facts are this. That Douglas Ross, of course, said in his own response that the situation improved in Spain, and that is correct. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine showed a marked improvement in the position in Spain, with point prevalence going down to 0.015%. And that is the reason, of course, why they were then put on the exempt list. When the situation worsened, just a matter of days later actually, worsened considerably, all of the UK nations decided to take them off that exempt list. So again, we made the decisions for purely epidemiological reasons. And when it comes to the UK government and the messages that we have seen, can I remind Douglas Ross of what we've seen from the UK government and the messages that have been revealed? He had a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, that Douglas Ross not only backed to the very end, invited to his party conference. Boris Johnson, who allegedly, according to the evidence we've heard, said, "Let the bodies pile up high." When discussing long COVID, he called it, and forgive me, Presiding Officer, for the language, bollocks. We had a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who partied in number 10 while loved ones missed the funerals of their relatives. So yes, we could have done better when it came to the retention of informal messages. But when it comes to steering this country through some of its darkest days, I'm very pleased we had Nicola Sturgeon in charge here in the Scottish Government, as opposed to Boris Johnson.
I would remind all members of the need for courtesy, and members, I would be grateful if you could desist for a moment. Just let's remind one another of the need for courtesy and respect in this chamber, and that applies to using quotations, to use words that might otherwise be regarded as unparliamentary. I'm also very conscious, as I've said, of the numbers who wish to put questions today, and I would be grateful for more concise questions and responses. And I call Douglas Ross.
Even after yesterday's evidence from the former First Minister, the words we've heard from the COVID-bereaved Humza Yousaf still backs her to the hilt. And that tells you everything you need to know about this First Minister, who is simply the continuity candidate for Team Sturgeon. But as Health Secretary during the pandemic, he joked about not knowing what he was doing. When he sent that message, by that stage, 10,000 people in Scotland had already lost their lives from COVID. But he wasn't the only one that's been found out. Nicola Sturgeon destroyed evidence on an industrial scale. The SNP government considered independence for key decisions. They did things for purely political reasons. They broke promises to grieving families and the public who sacrificed so much. Humza Yousaf was winging it, but hasn't the whole SNP government been found out?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I go back to the point that I've made several times in these exchanges over the weeks, that I absolutely accept wholeheartedly that a retention policy on informal communications clearly could have and should have been better. That's why, of course, I've commissioned that externally led review. But on the big calls, many of the decisions that we made helped to save lives. If we look at some of the evidence that's been presented to the COVID inquiry, if we look at the evidence from Professor Sir Ian Diamond, and Jackie Bailey shouting she may want to listen actually to the evidence by Professor Sir Ian Diamond. He's the Chief Executive of the UK Stats Authority and UK National Statistician. He gave details of age standardised mortality rates per 100,000 right across the 4 nations. This is his data, not my data. And that analysis shows that in Scotland, of course, we had the lowest level of deaths per 100,000, according to the ASMR data. Now, every single one of those lives lost is undoubtedly a tragedy. In fact, many of my colleagues on these benches lost a loved one to COVID. But on those calls, the decisions we made have helped to save lives. Let's look at what the World Health Organization said, and again, not my data, the World Health Organization's data. They estimated that 22,138,000 lives in Scotland were saved as a direct result of the COVID-19 vaccination programme. So I accept fully that when it comes to informal communications, we could have and should have done better. There are also other decisions which, of course, we look at and we think we could have perhaps moved quicker or moved earlier or done things differently. So while political opponents may well try to rewrite history and engage in, frankly, smears, insults
briefly, please, First
towards
Minister.
Government ministers and civil servants, I can stand up here and say that I know that every single day of that pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon, the rest of us in the Scottish Government, civil servants included, worked for one reason and one reason only: to protect the people of Scotland from the harms of COVID.